A single candle flickers in the corner of a stone infirmary, its flame bent by the breath of a cold draught that slithers beneath the door. Wax gathers and cools in slow, heavy drops, thick like sorrow on the table's edge, where iron tools rest beside crumpled cloths, darkened with the stains of old battles not fought with swords, but with fever. The walls around it breathe dampness. Lichen creeps in patterns like forgotten script, green and brown and grey where the stone never dries. The room carries a silence that is not still, but listening. Somewhere above, a rat shifts in the rafters. Its claws scraped wood with quiet precision, a sound that has long ceased to startle. It is part of this place, like the ache in the bones of the old floor, like the smoke marks that stretch upward from the hearth, like the boy lying beneath a patched woolen blanket, barely moving. He is no older than 12, pale as scraped parchment, with sweat beating across his brow like dew before a storm. His lips twitch with the echoes of a dream or a fevered prayer. His breathing stumbles, sharp, then shallow, as if the air itself cannot be trusted. Beside him, Brother Aldrich leans. Over a stone mortar, he grinds the blackened husk of a frog into fine, bitter powder. His hands do not tremble. He does not glance at the boy. He only listens to the rhythm of the pestle, to the far-off tolling of the priory bells, to the moan of wind curling through broken shutters. His movements are careful, almost reverent, like a man performing a ritual older than the memory of this monastery, and in many ways he is. Aldrich was once a scribe. His fingers once traced golden letters onto holy vellum. Now they trace the cracks in flesh and fever. Now he writes his prayers in poultices and bloodletting, in ash and leeches. He no longer asks why. He only acts. The boy's mother waits beyond the threshold, where she has not been invited to step further. Her wool cloak is damp with snowmelt and old fear. Her hands, cracked and stained by years of lie and frost and childbirth, grip the cloth tightly across her chest. Her lips move with whispered Latin mangled by her tongue, but meant with aching clarity. The prayer is not for God, it is for the Virgin, a mother to another son, a woman who once knelt beside a child slipping towards stillness. The infirmary door remains closed, but not sealed. Cold light bleeds beneath it, dim and bluish, like moonlight on a grave. Aldrich lifts a glass jar, its surface filmed with mist. Inside, the leeches writhe black ribbons, swimming slowly in their own suspended hunger. They do not care for names, nor saints, nor sorrow. They care only for blood. One by one, he removes them. His fingers are steady, as though handling relics. He places the first along the boy's forearm, murmuring a fragment of Galenic Latin that no longer holds meaning, only rhythm. Then another at the boy's ankle. The third rests above the hollow of his collarbone. The boy stirs, but does not wake. His chest rises with a soft groan, as if reluctant to breathe again. This is not cruelty. This is faith refracted through the broken glass of medieval knowing. They believed then, not in germs, but in balance. In the four humours: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and bloody chelled in sacred tension within the body. And when one slipped, so too did the soul. Madness, ague, lethargy, the sweating sickness, they all had names, but no mercy. So the monks bled, purged, burned, and poulticed, not because they didn't care, but because they did. The boy's skin yields easily. The leeches fasten with a sound too soft to be heard. But Aldrich sees it, the minute tightening of the creature's body, the faint flush of red beneath its throat. He watches the blood bloom. A single drop rolls down the boy's wrist and pools at his fingertips. It looks almost peaceful. He does not expect the child to live, but neither does he let him go. He speaks now, not loudly, not clearly, but in a breath murmur only the boy's bones might hear. A prayer, perhaps, or something older, not scripture, but memory. The candle beside them flutters again, and for a moment Aldrich sees not the boy, but his younger brother, dead these 30 years. The same pallor, the same stillness, the same winter wind rattling the shutters, begging to be let in. Outside the door, the mother shifts her weight. She thinks she hears her son call out. She clutches a wooden token around her neck, too carved. Doves and a branch, given to her long ago by her husband before he died in the fields, coughing red foam. She does not open the door. She only lowers her head, pressing the token to her lips. Inside, Aldrich prepares the sap, burnt frog ash, mixed with goat lard, warmed just enough to spread. He rubs it across the boy's chest in a slow spiral. The mixture smells of bitter roots and old bone. It is meant to draw out the humours, or, if it cannot, to ease the passage of the soul through whatever veil awaits. The fire crackles, low and resentful. The shadows in the corners seem to thicken. Then a sound. The boy's breath deepens, steadier. He groans. This time louder. His eyelids twitch. Aldrich pauses. He waits. 1 heartbeat. 2. The boy turns his head slightly toward the fire. Still alive. Aldrich does not weep. He only moves to change the bandages, to wipe the sweat from the boy's neck, to pour a thin broth into a cup should he wake before dawn. He does not speak to the mother. Not yet. Faith here is not thunder. It is not angels. It is the soft hiss of a leech drinking from a dying child, and the gentleness of a monk who still believes that effort means something. Later, the wind will rise again. The bell will toll for matins. The fever may return, or it may not. But for tonight, Aldrich will stay. He will watch the leeches fill, and the fire burn low, and the boys sleep with breath still in his chest. Outside, the mother kneels in the snow, her hands still joined, and the candle flickers on the table, wax spilling like time melting quietly into the dark. The frost arrived early that year. It crept beneath the doors before the harvest was finished, curling into the straw and settling behind the eyes of every villager like a warning. The last apples shriveled on their branches. The barley went soft with rot before the scythes reached it. Children coughed through the night, and no one spoke of what they feared would come with the snow. In the village below the priory, the well had begun to sour. Not in taste its water was still clear and cold, but in spirit. Women no longer gathered there to laugh or share news. They came alone now, faces drawn tight, glancing over their shoulders as if the very earth might listen. A calf was born with no eyes. A baby died before it drew breath. A black bird perched for 7 days upon the same cottage roof and would not fly. It was in that same cottage that Brother Aldrich arrived, cloaked in his winter robe, clutching his satchel of vials and rags, and the heavy pouch of leeches that had not yet been emptied since the boy. His knees ached from kneeling. His fingers still bore the stain of frog ash beneath his nails. But when the message came that a girl had taken ill, and her mother had lit a candle at the edge of the field in silent plea, he had not hesitated. He did not knock. The door opened for him, as if the cold itself had been waiting. Inside the hearth smoked weakly, as though reluctant to burn. The air was thick with garlic, vinegar, and grief. The girl, no more than 14, lay curled on a straw mattress near the fire, her body shaking in fits, her skin flushed dark red with fever. A shallow basin beneath her chin held the bile of her last breath. She made no sound now, only the fire did, whispering its hollow song. Her mother did not cry. She stood in the corner, silent, hollow-eyed, hands stained with soot. She had burned every herb she owned. Even the blue cloths saved for St. Agnes's feast had been fed to the flames. Nothing worked. Aldrich crossed the room slowly. He did not speak. There was no comfort he could offer that would not crack beneath the weight of her silence. He knelt beside the girl and removed his gloves. Her skin burned like a forge. He opened the satchel. The ritual began again, not out of habit, but because it was all he had. Bloodletting, burnt ash, heated lard. A whisper of Latin meant more for the act than the meaning. He crushed the last of the summer's dried nettle into a bowl and mixed it with the toad, ash, and vinegar. He smeared the paste beneath her ribs and along the hollow of her throat. Her breath caught. Her fingers twitched. The leeches came next. They moved slowly this time, sluggish from the cold, but hungry. He placed one on her neck, another at her wrist, two behind her knees. He held her hand until the blood began to rise. He did not know her name, only that someone had called for him before it was too late, and even that might be a lie. The mother began to murmur not words, not a prayer, just sound, a humming, low and rhythmic, the same melody women use to rock their infants, long before the child learned to speak. It filled the room like smoke, like memory. Aldrich worked without pausing. Time was fragile now. The girl's chest rattled like an empty lantern in wind. Her lips moved, but no voice came. Her eyes fluttered open, once cloudy, unfocused down, then closed again, still breathing. But faintly, he sat with her through the night. The fire burned low, then lower still. At some point, the mother fell asleep, upright against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees like a child hiding from the dark. When dawn came, it brought no light, only fog, a soft, colorless mist that swallowed the sky and pressed itself against the window panes like a shroud. Crows gathered in the fields beyond the village, silent and unmoving. Aldrich rose stiffly, replaced the poultices, and removed the leeches, now bloated, black with blood, slow and satisfied. He washed her forehead with cool water and waited. She breathed, and then again, just a little stronger than before. He turned to the mother. She was still sleeping, her mouth open, her shoulders slack, exhausted not just by fear, but by years of being the one who held the line, the one who burned her feast day cloth, the one who buried a husband and still cooked supper the next night. Aldrich let her sleep. He stepped outside into the fog, where his footprints vanished as soon as they were made. The chill wrapped around his ankles like vines. The priory bell rang in the distance, its sound blurred and muffled, but still steady. There was another child in the far end of the village, he'd been told. A son of the cooper, also coughing, the same red flush, the same dreams of water, perhaps the same sickness, or perhaps just the same fear. He would go, he must go. The remedies did not always save. He knew that. Sometimes the child died anyway. Sometimes they lived but never woke. Sometimes the fever took not the body but the mind. But each time he entered a house, each time he opened his satchel and crushed the ash, he gave them something, a chance, a ritual, a fragment of order in a world unraveling from the edges. And sometimes the child lived. Sometimes the breath deepened and the fever broke. And the candle on the hearth was not extinguished after all, in a world where even the churchman fell ill, and no Latin words could hold back the rats at the granary. That was enough. As Aldrich passed the well, he paused. He looked down into its black mouth, the water glinting faintly far below. His reflection did not greet him, only the darkness. He crossed himself, not for his soul, for hers, for all of them. Then he turned toward the cooper's house, the fog rising to meet him like a veil, and behind him the village breath-tone, waiting but not yet silent. The fog did not lift. It pressed in day after day, clinging to thatched roofs and curling into chimneys, turning every breath to mist and every hour to dusk. The sun became a memory spoken of by children and old men like a thing they once saw in a dream. And with the fog came silence, not the silence of sleep, the silence of dread. Hushed voices at the well, doors that did not open, smoke that rose, without sound or smell. Brother Aldrich moved through it like a wraith, his robe growing heavier with every home he entered. He no longer counted the children, no longer asked their names. There was no space left for names, only for the rhythm of fever, the weight of breath, the pattern of poultices applied and blood drawn and leeches set gently on thin, shaking limbs. In the cooper's house, the child had already died before Aldrich arrived. The mother would not let go. She cradled the boy against her chest, rocking gently on the packed dirt floor, humming an old tavern tune with no words. Her mouth bled from biting her lip. She did not blink. Aldrich knelt beside her and whispered something, but she did not hear. The boy's skin was cold. The leeches would not have fed on him even if he'd tried. He stayed long enough to place a hand on the boy's head, to murmur a psalm. Then he left. The door remained open behind him. The mother did not move. That night, the priory bells rang for the dead not once, but 3 times. Once for the cooper's son, once for the blacksmith's apprentice, and once for a monk from the neighboring abbey who had collapsed mid-prayer and never risen again. Even the bells began to sound afraid. Rumors spread like mold beneath bread-crust quiet, thick, impossible to wash out. Some said it was the water. Some said it was the water. Some said it was the rats. Some said it was a punishment. Too many children born out of wedlock. Too many saints forgotten. A curse. A reckoning. The sins of the fathers returned to collect what was owed. The parish priest, Father Osborne, began holding mass, daily cloaked in violet, his voice brittle with strain. But fewer and fewer came. The pews grew empty. The candles burned lower, and the smell of incense could no longer mask the scent of rotting herbs soaked in vinegar. One evening, after the final toll of Compline, Aldrich found Osborne seated at the altar steps, hands buried in his face, his breath ragged. "They no longer believe," the priest whispered. Aldrich sat beside him, silent. "They do not bring their children. To me, they do not ask for blessings. They ask you for your salves, your frog ash, your leeches, not the host." The monk did not reply. He watched the candlelight flicker across the marble floor, watched how it struggled to hold shape in the damp. "It is not faith they seek," he said quietly. "It is delay." Outside, the fog curled against the stained glass windows, smearing the faces of Saints Dot. Inside, the 2 men sat beside the altar, cloaked in silence, as if awaiting judgment they had already accepted. The days grew shorter. Aldrich's back began to hunch from exhaustion. He dreamt of fire, each night tongues of flame licking the walls of the infirmary, faces melting into wax, frogs crawling across the floor with human eyes. When he awoke, his mouth tasted of ash, and his heart beat like a drum calling soldiers. To a war that had no sides, no victors, only graves. Still, he went to the baker's son, who laughed even while coughing blood, to the reeve's wife, who begged him to lie to her daughter, to the woodcutter's twins, who died within hours of each other and were wrapped together in the same shroud. He did what he could. He burned the herbs, applied the lard, set the leeches, cleaned his hands with cold river water when the well ran dry, the fog remained. Then one morning, just before Lord's, something changed. Aldrich passed the field beyond the priory and saw, for the first time in weeks, a bird, not a crow, a swallow, small, frail, its wings twitching. It sat alone on the fence post, as if it, too, had forgotten where the sky was, as if it were unsure how to leave. He stood and watched it for a long time. Later that day, he returned to the boy from the infirmary, the one with the staggered breath and frost-slicked brow. He had survived, thin, barely able to speak, but his eyes were clear now. He smiled when Aldrich entered the room, though he had no strength to lift his head. The mother wept into her apron, the kind of weeping that comes only when something impossible has been spared. Aldrich sat beside the boy and took his hand. "Did I die?" the child whispered. Aldrich shook his head. "No," he said, "you returned." The boy closed his eyes and slept again. That night, Aldrich did not return to the priory. He stood at the edge of the field until the fog began to thin, until the stars returned to their posts in the heavens, pale and flickering and stubborn. He whispered a prayer not from scripture, but from memory, the kind of prayer monks forget they know, a plea not for strength, but for gentleness, for the fire not to burn too bright, for the suffering to slow. The wind shifted. The candle in the boy's room did not go out. Aether days no longer passed in sequence. They bled into one another, like water into ink, shapeless, colorless, bitter. Time in the priory lost its rhythm, as if the bells had grown tired of ringing, or the hours themselves no longer wanted to be known. Brother Aldrich began to cough. At first, it was light, dry. He dismissed it with salt water and time, telling no one. He worked as he always had, moving between homes, cloaked in damp wool and silence. But something had changed. His fingers trembled now when he ground the ash. The mortar felt heavier. His prayers faltered mid-verse. He did not allow himself rest. The children still called. The mothers still lit candles on windowsills, hoping he would see them through the fog. And so he answered, even when his breath shortened, even when his vision blurred after climbing the hill to the thatcher's cottage, even when he bled into the cloth he kept tucked inside his robe. The villagers began to notice, not openly, not with words, but with distance. They no longer welcomed him past the threshold. They left the sick in the doorway. The doors stayed open just long enough to hand him the bundle a child wrapped in linen, or a bowl of bile, or a note scrawled with trembling ink. "She won't eat, please. Help us." The fear was no longer of death. It was of what might cling to the ones who walk too, often with it. Even the priest, Father Osborne, avoided Aldrich's eyes during Mass. Once they had stood shoulder to shoulder. Now there was always an empty pew between them, as though something invisible had taken up residence there, something that neither scripture nor poultice could name. Aldrich began sleeping in the infirmary. He did not trust himself near the dormitories. He feared what he might bring with him. what he might leave behind. His cough worsened. At night, it echoed in the rafters, startling the rats into stillness. He covered his mouth with linen, but the stains grew darker each morning. Still, he worked. He boiled leeches and counted bones and whispered psalms to children too weak to respond. He smeared ashlar salves across fevered skin and breathed through the stench of rot that no longer seemed to leave his clothes. But there were days quiet, cruel days when the silence grew so loud it pressed against his chest like stone, and in those moments he remembered his brother, a boy with golden hair, lost to a sickness that arrived without warning and left behind only his wool tunic and a hollowed-out room. Aldrich had been 12. He had prayed, then truly prayed, with knees cracked and voice shaking. No miracle came, but still he believed. Still he had given his life to something larger, something sacred. The monastery had been his sanctuary, his penance, his oath, and now even that sanctuary seemed to shrink from him. One night, as frost whitened the windows and the wind moaned low like a wounded animal, Aldrich collapsed. He had been preparing a tincture. His hand slipped, the pestle fell, and then the floor met him with a cold slap of stone. He woke hours later. The fire nearly out, the blanket from the cot half draped over his chest. Someone had found him. Or perhaps no one had. Perhaps the candlelight had simply spared him out. Of habit, his breath rattled. He sat upright and vomited into the basin. It was red that morning. He did not visit the sick. He sat alone in the infirmary, the leeches twitching in their jar beside him. His skin burned. His bones ached as though hollowed out by some slow, unseen chisel. He looked at his hands. Pale, trembling unrecognizably, and for the first time in many years, Brother Aldrich felt fear, not of dying, but of fading without meaning, of leaving behind no healing, no saved child, no final word that would echo that evening. A knock came at the infirmary door. It was not a villager. It was a girl, perhaps 15, dressed in the robe of the novices. She stood barefoot, her face flushed from running. She held a bundle wrapped in thick wool. A child not hers, a neighbor's boy, burning with fever, barely breathing. They said you would not come, she whispered. So I brought him to you. Aldrich stared at her. His head swam. He could not stand. He wanted to tell her to go, that he was no longer safe, that he carried what might kill the boy, that he was hollow now, nothing but cough and ash and blood. Too dark to name, but he said none of it. He gestured to the table. She laid the boy down. His skin was slick with sweat. His pulse fluttered like a moth trapped beneath glass. Aldrich reached for the salve with shaking hands. He dipped his fingers in the lard, thickened with nettle and ash, and smeared it across the boy's brow. He whispered no words this time. His voice was gone. All that remained was motion, touch, hope bound in silence. The girl wept as she watched, not loudly, just quietly enough that the candle flame shivered. Aldrich placed one leech at the boy's wrist, one on his ankle, one at the hollow of his neck, and then he waited. The child stirred, his breath caught, then faintly it deepened. The girl covered her mouth. Aldrich lowered his head, closing his eyes, not in prayer, but in release. The moment stretched long and thin and warm. Outside, snow began to fall, for the first time in weeks. It fell clean, soft, white, weightless, like absolution, and in the stillness of that room, lit only by the fading candle and the glow of the hearth, Aldrich felt it, the nearness of the end, not in despair, but in peace. He had given all he could, and in that small miracle, the breath of a child not yet taken, he had found enough. Nd in the distance. Somewhere beyond the hill, a second swallow took flight. The boy lived by morning, the fever had broken. His lips were pink again. He drank broth, and though his voice was no stronger than a reed in wind, he whispered Aldrich's name before falling back asleep. The girl, her name was Ismin, watched over him with a quiet reverence, as though witnessing something sacred. She did not speak often, but when she did, her words carried the weight of the old psalms. She had not come from noble blood. She was the daughter of a tanner, drawn to the priory not by calling, but by necessity. Yet in her, Aldrich saw a steadiness he had long since lost in himself. He taught her the rituals, how to measure ash by eye, how to press salve in spirals, how to wait without hope, but never without care. His cough worsened. There were days he could not rise from the infirmary cot, days when blood flecked his lips before the sun had risen. Still, he worked slowly from the table, from memory, guiding Ismin's hands as his own began to fail. But the village was shifting. Where once the candlelit windows had welcomed him, now the doors stayed bolted. Where once mothers waited barefoot in the frost for his knock, now they crossed themselves when his name was spoken. They said he carried the sickness, that he had brought it with him from the monastery's inner holes, that it spread through his robes, his breath, the soil beneath his feet. A whisper began to curl like smoke through the thatched eaves. Leeches, or no ash, or no. The monk has the devil's hand. It was Father Osborne who came to him first, not in anger, in weariness. They sat across from one another beneath the rafters of the empty chapel, where the crucifix hung in shadow and the wind slipped through the broken glass like a warning. "You've done all you can," Osborne said. "Let others take up the care." "There are no others," Aldrich replied. The priest did not argue. Instead, he set a folded piece of parchment on the table, a writ, sealed by the bishop's steward. A quiet command. Exile. For the health of the village, for the sanctity of the priory, for appearance. Aldrich did not protest. He only nodded. And that night, while the monks sang Compline and the villagers doused their hearths, he packed what little remained of his tools, his mortar, a half-full jar of leeches, the last of the frog ash, and the boy's worn blanket, still holding. The scent of life wrestled back from death. He left before dawn. No one saw him go but Ismin. She stood at the gate with her hands clasped and tears. She did not try to hide. "I will keep the work," she said. He placed his hand on her head, not as a priest, but as something older, something quieter. And then he turned, robe dragging in the frost, the bell tower behind him no longer ringing. He walked east, through fields emptied by winter, through woods where the snow fell silently on moss and bone. He did not know where he would go, only that he could not stay, and yet, even in exile, the work followed him. The first cottage he came upon sat crooked at the edge of a river, its thatch blackened by smoke, its walls slumping like tired shoulders. A woman answered his knock, skeptical, silent, but when he showed her the mortar, when he whispered the old words, she stepped aside. A child lay inside, fevered, breathing quick and sharp. He set to work. Word spread by the week's end. He had found a placer barn offered by a widow who'd lost 3 sons to the summer plague. No one visited openly, but at night figures appeared at the edge of the trees, small bundles left on the step, letters written in charcoal, a cough, a moan, a name. He answered all of them, not as a healer, as a witness. Each night he sat by the fire and watched the leeches move, their black bodies pulsing with slow hunger, symbols of an age grasping for balance, for meaning, for something to hold in the shadow of death. And in the quiet, Aldrich began to remember not just the sickness, but the song his mother hummed as she ground mustard seeds, the weight of his brother's head in his lap, the smell of candle wax and sheep fat and wet wood, the first psalm he ever copied in golden ink. His body weakened, but his memory grew sharp. And then one night a knock came, soft and hesitant. He opened the door to find Ismene. Her robes were travel-worn, her hands dirtied with herbs and soot, but her eyes were clear. "I've come to learn what remains," she said. He let her in, and together, by firelight, they opened the jars, the scrolls, the half-remembered prayers written on the walls of his failing body. She ground the ash. He spoke the words. She placed the leeches. He whispered the rhythm, and as the snow fell heavy on the roof, Aldrich closed his eyes, not in death, not yet, but in peace, because the knowledge had not died with him, it had passed on. Not in books, in hands, in breath, in blood, in the sacred, quiet act of trying, always trying, even when the bells stopped ringing, even when the doors stayed closed, even when the name was no longer remembered, but the work still was. When the thaw came, it came slowly. The snow softened, crusted with meltwater. The trees, still stripped bare, whispered with wind again. Roads turned to mud, and boots sank with each step. Smoke returned to the chimneys. The birds, first in pairs, then in flocks, came back to the hills, but not to the barn. It remained quiet. The fire had long since died, the leeches gone, still in their jar, floating in water that had turned the color of old bronze. The tools lay clean on the table, wrapped in linen. A psalter sat open beside them, not marked with blood or ash, but with a pressed flower, dried and near colorless. Brother Aldrich's body had been buried by the river, where the earth was soft enough to yield. No one came to mourn him. No mass was held, no bell tolled. But when the widow who gave him the barn passed by the grave, she left a bundle of herbs and a piece of cloth soaked in vinegar. She did not weep. She simply bowed her head, and further east, beyond the fields and frost, the name of the monk with the dark cough began to change shape. Some called him a saint. Others said he'd gone mad, taken by fever and frogs, leeches and false prayers. Most said nothing at all, but the children lived, and that was all Ismene needed to remember. She had not returned to the priory. There was no welcome waiting for her. There, instead, she walked barefoot at times to each place Aldrich had once gone. The cooper's house, the thatcher's hut, the field where the swallow had rested before spring. They remembered her, and when the next sickness came, not fever this time, but swelling blood beneath the skin, the kind that made even priests turn away, they brought their children to her quietly at night, wrapped in blankets, faces half covered with linen. She did not light candles, she did not speak psalms, she only worked. The mortar still turned in her hands, the ash still stained her nails, the salves still carried the scent of nettle and goat. Lard and the leeches she bred them herself now thrived in the warmth of her cellar. Silent and waiting, there was no miracle. Sometimes the children still died. She buried them herself, wrapped them in linen, whispered something low before laying soil on their chests. But more often now they lived, and the village began to change. They stopped knocking, they started watching. Ismin's name, once whispered in fear, was now etched into wooden beams, scratched into the backs of spoons, carved into the stone of the well. The children called her the girl with the dark water. The mothers called her the healer. The priest said nothing in the priory. They pretended she had never entered the cloister at all. But in the woods, beyond the reach of bells and parchment, a new silence took shape. Not the silence of fear, the silence of listening, of reverence. Once, a traveller from the south asked her if she had been taught by the old monk who cured children with toads and soot. She did not answer. She only placed her hands on the boy's chest and waited. The story had already moved on. Aldrich's name faded, but his shape did not. He became the leechman of the frost, the monk who bargained with death, and the ghost who wandered from door to door, asking nothing but a candle and a bowl of water. Some said he had never existed at all, but every healer born after knew the ash must be dark, the lard must be soft, the leech must be placed not in fear but in faith, and that knowledge sacred, quiet, handed from breath to breath, outlived every record. Ismin lived to an old age. She never wed, never took the veil. She tended her cellar, her herbs, her dead, and when she felt her time near, she gathered her things, the mortar, the jar, the linen wrapped, set them on her table beneath the open window, where wind could carry their scent. Into the trees, a child found her there, the same child she had once saved, now grown, now a mother, and from that table the knowledge passed on again. No bells, no burial, just a girl grinding ash into powder, whispering the old rhythm into the mortar, listening to the wind move through the shutters. The village changed, the world changed. The monks left the priory, the field where Aldrich fell sick grew over with barley. The church bells broke their ropes and were never repaired. But now and then, when a child grew fevered and the moon hung low and red in the sky, someone would still light a candle, not for God, for the leechman, for the girl with ash on her hands, for the ones who stayed when others fled. And in that flickering light, where the wax spilt like tears and silence held its breath, the old work lived on. They called her a witch in the end, not in hate, not exactly, but in fear, wrapped in reverence. The kind of word that slips between lips and never settles, not entirely. The kind of word used when no other fits by then. Ismin had long since ceased to speak of Aldrich, not out of shame, but because his name had changed too many times, because what he was had already become what they needed, a story. The man who stole sickness from a child's bones, the ghost monk who whispered to rats, the priest who turned from scripture and fed on blood, the boy who returned from death, only to vanish into the frost again. And yet the healing worked. Across the hills, women copied her methods. In quiet corners, without blessing or writ, they crushed herbs against stone. They bred leeches in buckets of river water. They burned frogs and mixed the ash with lard and rosemary. They did not write what they learned. They passed it through hands, and through hands it survived, even when the scribes refused to record it, even when the church forbade it, even when lords burned women for knowing too much, too deeply, too well. Still, the work endured, because it had not begun with Aldrich, and it would not end with Ismin. It had always been the same quiet fire, passed from fevered room to fevered room, from mother to daughter, from outcast to novice, from the edge of belief to the center of the wound. Aldrich's grave became overgrown. No marker, no stone, just moss and time and silence. The barn where he died was torn down one spring to make way for a road that never held, but beneath the earth. The leeches still bred in the dark, wet hollows, and in some places people still whispered his name before bleeding a wound. Still left candles on the riverbank when their children coughed. Ismene was buried without a procession. A child placed a single jar beside her grave glass, stoppered with wax. Inside it, to Leeches writhing still. Years passed, generations forgot. The priory became ruins, swallowed by ivy. The stained glass shattered by weather and war. A shepherd once found a scrap of vellum in the mud near its stones. A psalm written in gold, the ink flaking like scabbed blood. He did not understand the words, but he carried it in his pocket for the rest of his life. In the village that once feared the fog, a healer still lived. A woman with a narrow mouth and hands like wood grain. She knew how to pack a wound with moss, how to read bruises like maps. When asked where she had learned it, she only said, "It's always been here." And perhaps it had. Perhaps it was never about Aldrich or Ismene, or even the leeches that bloomed fat with stolen blood. Perhaps it was something older, something that lived in the breath, between a mother's cry and a child's stillness, something that remembered. There are places, quiet places, forgotten by kings and maps, where the ash still smokes, where a rusted mortar lies half buried, beneath a collapsed barn, where a river carves its way past a grove of oaks and the reeds grow in a perfect circle, as though shaped by hands long, vanished. And sometimes, if the fog comes heavy and the bells have long since stopped, a light appears in the distance, a figure in a robe, face unseen, walking through frost and silence, carrying nothing but a candle and a prayer, pressed into breath. Not a ghost, not a myth, just a memory that refuses to be erased. The last caretaker of the blood ritual, the first to burn frogs into powder and call it hope, a monk who bargained with death and taught a girl to do the same. And in the stillness, beyond parchment and psalter, that story remains, passed between children at twilight, scratched into cottage beams, sewn into the hems of aprons worn by women who refuse to stop trying, not because they believe it will always work, but because someone once chose to stay, chose to kneel beside the dying, even when his own blood coughed up onto the stone, chose to place the leech, chose to whisper the prayer, chose to light the candle, and believed, if only for a night, that it would be enough. It was the stone that caught her eye, not because it was carved, it wasn't, not because it marked a grave, there were no names left, but because it shouldn't have been there, half buried in the riverbank, ringed by wild mint and hollow reeds, still black with rot that no season had managed to bleach away. She had been walking, following no path, a field historian, trained in maps and ruins, in parchments and wax seals. She'd come looking for a lost priory, mentioned only once in a crumbling estate ledger, a passing line, the brothers of Frost and Lard. She'd laughed at the phrasing now. She stared at the stone. It was warm under her palm, despite the cold. Beside it, tangled in root and watergrass, was a shape that didn't belong to the wild. Glass. Clouded with age, she pulled it free. Inside, floating in what had once been brine, lay the curled husk of a leech, black and folded like a sleeping question. She turned it in her hand. There were no markings, no labels, no reason it should still be here. But she knew somewhere beyond language or reason. She knew. That night, in her rented cottage, she laid the jar on the hearth. She made tea she did not drink, and she opened her notebook to write the first entry of the expedition. But the words didn't come. Not about the priory, not about ruins. Only this: they left no names. Only warmth in stone. Only ash in the mortar. Only silence, where once someone waited beside the dying. She closed the notebook. She did not submit the report. Instead, she returned. Each day for a week, she followed the river. She mapped the slope of the land, the curve of the trees, and at the center of it all, that black stone, that buried barn foundation, that still air that made birds refuse to nest. There was something here. She couldn't say what. And then, one morning, the frost came late, a dusting across the grass like breath. Caught in time, she woke to find the jar gone from her windowsill. No signs of entry. No tracks, no wind, just absence. And where it had been, a smear of ash dot. Only that, years later, she would publish her notes. Not in a journal, but in a thin, quiet book, bound in soft linen. Only 50 copies printed. It never found an audience, but it found the right reader, a healer, a woman with ash beneath her nails and a habit of silence, who read the book in one sitting, then placed it beneath her pillow like a charm. She began keeping jars, not because she believed, but because someone, once, had stayed. Because someone had written their faith not in ink, but in rot and heat and a boy's breath drawn back from the brink. The story unraveled and rewoved. It was no longer about Aldrich. It was no longer about Ismin. They were gone, their names ground down like the old mortar, their rituals stripped of meaning by time and distance. But the question remained, that quiet, flickering question that every healer, every mother, every watcher at a sickbed knows too. Well, what if I stay? What if I try? What if just this once it works? And across time, through frost and fire, through jars and herbs and forgotten stones, that question passed on, not as scripture, as instinct, as ritual, as breath. The modern world no longer believed in leeches. Not really, but still they hung in museum glass, preserved in exhibits none remembered funding. Still they pulsed in backwater streams. Still they fed in silence, remembering dot, and sometimes in places where hospitals flickered with power outages, or war made medicine run dry. Someone would reach for a jar, not out of knowledge, out of memory, and it would work. Sometimes just enough, and in that moment, in that breath, the candle flickered again. Somewhere in the dark, the jar cracked in winter. No one saw it happen. No hands dropped it. No shelf failed. It cracked on its own quietly, without sound, a thin line drawn through the glass, like a breath caught in frost. The leech inside had long since curled to dust, its shape intact, but its purpose forgotten. It sat there, forgotten too, on a shelf in a rural apothecary museum, labeled wrong, specimen, Annelida, early 18th century, the light above. It flickered sometimes, no one fixed it, and yet, those who worked there, if asked, would say they avoided that shelf at night, that when they turned to lock the door, they sometimes felt watched, not by eyes, but by intention, like the past itself was waiting not to haunt, but to be remembered elsewhere. In a small northern village where the wind howls through chimney bricks and sheep huddle near frostbitten fences, A child falls ill, a boy no older than the one Aldrich first saved. He sweats through linen. His breath shivers. The doctor is called, but the roads are frozen. The clinic powerless. The fever climbs. The mother does not pray. Not at first. She watches. She waits. She wipes his forehead with cloth steeped in vinegar and herbs passed down, without reason. And then she remembers a story, not from a book, but from the mouth of her own mother. And her mother before, a monk, a girl, a jar. She does not believe it, but she tries in the cellar. Among pickling jars and dried garlic, she finds a small, cracked vessel, not the original, not anything sacred, just an echo. She fills it with river water. She waits, and in the morning she places it by the boy's bed. No miracle comes, but the fever breaks, slowly, as if reluctant. The boy lives. She never tells anyone, not because she's ashamed, but because something inside her whispers, it was never yours to speak aloud. Some stories don't need voices. They need silence. They need breath. They need someone willing to kneel beside the dying and wait without expecting an answer. A week later, she lights a candle. She doesn't know why, just that it feels necessary. She places it in the window, and in the flicker of that small flame, something stirs, not outside, not in the dark, but within the long, invisible thread that binds the living. To the dead it stirs in the breath that was almost lost in the hands that once mixed ash with lard. Lit with desperation, in the long-since buried bones of a monk who did not stop trying, in the quiet, calloused fingers of a novice who chose to stay after the bell stopped ringing. It stirs in memory, in myth, in that strange place between knowing and believing, and so it returns, not in books, not in chants, not in museums with wrong dates and broken lights. It returns in instinct, in the motion of a hand reaching for the jar, in the soft placing of cloth on a fevered brow, in the decision, quiet, personal, uncelebrated, to try one more time. That is all legacy is. Not statues, not scripture, just the willingness to care. Again and again, even when the cost is everything, even when no one sees, even when it will never be named. Aldrich's name was never recorded in the great ledgers. His death went unnoticed by the bishops. His rites were never sung, but his story endured, not as history, as inheritance. And so the jar cracked in winter, because some things must break so they can be passed on, so they can live not in glass, but in gesture, not in relic, but in rhythm, so they can vanish and yet remain. And if you listen, truly listen, on the nights when the wind wraps round your home and the world goes still, you might hear it, the soft clink of a pestle in mortar, the rustle of wool robes moving across stone, the breath of someone choosing, again, to kneel, and the candlelight flickering on the wall, not because it must, but because it still can.